Okay, good morning, Fabio.
Good morning. Hello, everybody. Hi.
Hi, Fabio.
Hi, Fabio.
Hi.
And who's missing? Anybody else just joined? So while we're waiting, I'll just share the results of the Google survey to explain where we're at. So this was 15 responses out of, I think, 18 altogether, a measure of satisfaction with the session. So that's good to know. This was these are the interesting things. So whether you would like more or less breakout room activity or more or less the same as day one, there was a fair, well, not a consensus, but the majority were happy to keep things more or less as they were the last session. But some of you would actually like more use of breakout rooms. So well, we could accommodate that. And then very, very similar, almost identical results. Well, actually identical results in terms of having more or less the same balance between breakout room and open discussion as on day one. And then a majority, clear majority, would like to extend the session by 30 minutes. So that's what we're going to do. Now, I appreciate that for some of you, the 20% who are quite happy with an hour, and may have very good reasons for only being available for an hour, then there's no disgrace in leaving after the hour because the sessions are recorded. And so you can catch up with the last half hour through watching the recording, if that's okay. And we may decide, in fact, that we've got nothing left to say and we'll just close it early. Let's see. But today I'm planning to run it through to what will be 1:30 for me and for the Italians, if that's okay. I appreciate that for those of you in Japan, etc., this takes you even later into the evening, but I have to respect that the wish to add the half hour, and I think it would help. It would help with these issues too. It would provide more time for breakout room and more time for open class discussion, and then more and also more input from me. So yeah, so that was, thanks for those of you who responded. As I said, that's a good turnout, and that's what we'll do. But I'm sensitive, as I said, to different time zones, different needs, etc. And so we can negotiate as we go along. It's your course after all. Who's just joined us? Leonilda, hi.
Hi, sorry I'm late. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Okay, we're still a couple of malingerers. Here's a little warm-up activity before we sort of get going, or before I put you into the breakout rooms. So in the chat, I just want you to write an adjective that describes your current mood or state of mind. It's not a test. And I shall. Scattered. James, who's that? Oh no, inquisitive. And your brain fried. I was going to write curious, Girish. Okay, there's several curious. Well, that's good. Fabio, you're busy, are you?
Very much. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we've all had a lot of screen time, Anne. I agree. Margaret, you're excited. That's good to know. Well, I hope you will be inspired, Katerina. This is a great way of reviewing evaluative language. And you can imagine doing this with students, that the range, of course, of adjectives would be much more limited, but something to work on. Carrie, you feel golden, or your state of mind is golden. Well, that's original.
I'm going
Would
to after this. I'm going to a Klimt exhibition, so I'm thinking gold already with Klimt.
Oh, where is the Klimt exhibition?
It's in Poblenou, in the Ideal Art Centre down there.
Okay.
It's an interactive. It's an interactive Klimt exhibition.
Oh,
People say
yeah.
it's really good. Recommend it.
Okay, I hadn't heard
I'll
about
tell you
that.
next week what it's like.
All right. Okay.
So in
Put
that,
it
on
the
that
list.
note, I probably will have to, because I need to leave. Like I had
Okay,
planned for
fine.
an hour, so I'll duck out a little bit early if we're going an hour and a half today.
Okay, no problem.
I'll ask to see.
Chill, says Amy. Okay, great. All right, well, let's get going then. And more or less, we're following the pattern of the last session. I'll put you into rooms. James, you're asking me, I'm apprehensive because I just don't know how it's going to work today. Well, that's all, but I'm sure it will, because it worked last time, I think. So we're going into the room. So the chapter is the Jane Arnold chapter on the self and motivation, and basically the same kind of task. So takeaways, questions, doubts that you'd like to bring back to the forum, the floor, when we resume. So I won't ask you to appoint spokespeople this time. I'll just spot around asking people to report on what their group talked about. So be prepared. Be prepared. That may be a better strategy, in fact, than appointing spokespeople, because the ones who are not spokespeople don't have to kind of pay so much attention. But this way, you can't wriggle out. Okay, so we are 16 people, 15. Okay, so 5 rooms of 3. Okay, there you go. So join your room, and we'll have about 10 minutes on this, and I'll be moving around. And there'll be a minute's warning given when we close. Here they come. I didn't visit your room, but I'll give you a chance to tell us what you talked about when everybody's back. And Christine joined us mid-breakout room. Christine. I didn't realize that I'm not told that somebody's hanging around in the main room waiting to be assigned a room. So I'm not sure if you can actually message me.
It was okay because I just reflected on what I should talk about when I joined the others. That was fine.
Has anybody else joined us inadvertently? Okay, I think we're all here. So group 1, I'm not going to, well, let's spot around and see what we can cover. Who was in group 1? Carrie, you were in group 1. What were you talking about?
Yes, we were talking about a couple of things to do with motivation, and talking about, first of all, we were talking about reframing and perhaps like trying to use different language rather than the language that we generally come up with at the moment. So Ruth had a really nice idea about, rather than doing those I can statements, which maybe one day a student can do it, but maybe the next day they can't, or maybe they can do it in some situations and they can't in others. So maybe reframing those statements as I did, meaning you did it on that day, but maybe it's different on a different day. Like reframing some of that language can help with motivation, because it might be frustrating if one day you can do it and the next day you can't, and then what do you do with that?
That's a really good point, actually. And I'll come back to that at the presentation station to talk about a lot of research now focusing on the fluctuations in things like motivation, not just from day to day, but from moment to moment, actually, during a task. What people are researchers are trying to do is kind of track those fluctuations and work out what it is that causes the ups and downs, literally in seconds or minutes. Exactly. So what a student could do one day, they don't necessarily won't find so easy to do the next kind of thing. And we need to be aware of that. But at the same time, perhaps record, keep in mind that, yes, they could do it once. So there's always a possibility they'll be able to do it again. Good. Yes. Anything else, Carrie?
Yeah, so then towards the end, we were talking about then mapping motivational techniques from other areas. So we were talking about, and I must apologize, I can't remember the name. Is it Ruth? What was the name of the woman that you did the interview with? It was interesting, that interview.
Oh, Jessica.
Jessica. And so reframing, taking motivational techniques from sport, for example, that she used,
Yes.
the manager of Barcelona Football Club, to use those techniques in her class, which is a super interesting, again, reframing, mapping from other areas. And I work in a tech company, and so a lot of the motivational techniques that I use is I take from like other gaming, like when people are creating games, what motivational techniques do they get for people to continue using their games? And so we can do that again. How can we encourage people to continue studying with us? And we can use some of those techniques that they use in gaming. So there's a framework called Octalysis, which is really interesting, and it talks about the difference between intrinsic motivation, which comes from within you, and extrinsic, which is still motivation, but comes from maybe your parents telling you, or there's something else telling you have to do something, and how you can move between those intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. Octalysis.
What's it called?
Octalysis. I'll post an article on the forum. I saw that James had put a nice place to put bibliography.
Yes, brilliant. Okay, lovely. Thank you, Carrie. Yes, if you haven't had a chance to watch that interview with Jessica, please do, because she's very articulate, apart from anything else, in terms of describing the research. It's much more easy to listen to somebody talking about their research than to read the research papers. But yes, and I want to come back to that study and that theory of motivation in a minute. But just let's who was in group 2? Anna, did you touch on anything significantly different from group 1?
Yeah, kind of, because we have very different contexts. James and Leonid and I, we work in different countries with different contexts, and we were discussing the self. We were in doubt a little bit of the alteration in self-image. Yeah, but then it was so interesting because James mentioned that when he learned French, he kind of had an alteration in his self-image, learning about the culture, learning about wine and cheese, the food there. And Leonid works with teenagers, and they are kind of insecure, and their self-image is like a little bit, I don't know, how can I say that? They are not so sure of themselves, and then they don't know if they are going to learn that, and if they're going to be good and learn how to speak. And in my context specifically, I work with professionals who usually start to learn later than the other people and have, work in progress, that's it. And they have big problems with, am I going to be able to speak correctly? Am I going to get this promotion? And so on. But basically we talked about that, and also about the ought to self and the feared selves. What, I don't know what people, how can I say that? The idea that they have of how they should speak the language, you know, am I going to be good enough? Am I not going to be good enough? But basically that was it, what we discussed.
Great. Yes, I mean, it's interesting point, this thing about self-image being also a dynamic, particularly as you say in adolescence, where it's not necessarily fixed, or it's in flux. I wonder if it ever is fixed, I guess. And, you know, coming back to James's case, where what you were saying on the forum, James, about having a more malleable self-image or different self-image for both French and German, and whether, you know, some people are, there is this construct that's been identified called ego permeability. It used to be talked about quite a lot in the literature on individual differences in second language acquisition, and it was hypothesized that some people had a more permeable ego. That is to say, they let more in. Yeah, like you think of permeable meaning not waterproof. They were able to take on board different aspects of their identity, or it was more malleable perhaps, whereas other people have less or lower ego permeability. They're kind of more fixed, and they feel threatened, for example, when they speak a second language, or not threatened, but insecure, because it doesn't feel like them. Yeah. And this is a major obstacle, hypothetically at least, to second language acquisition, this notion of ego permeability. I have to say, having said that I don't know whether the construct is still considered a valid one. I'm just looking at the index of our book, and there's no mention of ego permeability, but there was a time, at least, when it was considered to be quite influential in terms of language acquisition. Let's just report back from another group 3. Who was group 3? Cynthia, you were in group 3. I visited you.
Yeah. Well, we first talked about how useful having, well, I mean, I guess that's what I said, how useful I found the terms from this to be able to give, give words, so I can, it broke up the term of motivation. Usually we use motivation as a general sort of term, but by breaking it down into different elements and showing us different things, small changes that we can make in all of these, it kind of confirms your role as a teacher. Like you say, yes, I can, have an impact on this. So, and the other thing we talked about was visualization. How we both, I think, Katerina mentioned the visualization, and how she thought that was a great technique to use with the children, I think she was saying, and the whole drawing. So it gave her a tool to be able to use right away. And I found it quite useful as well for adults as well. We've seen it in like coaching environment, all these terms of limiting beliefs and visualization. It's like, oh, I can actually do this professionally, while language learning as well. And then we went on to our questions a lot and doubts were, how can we take this and how can we deal with these issues on an online learning environment? I think Amy works full-time online. I think she always does that, yeah. And so do I. So, and Katarina has also found herself in this context. So we were wondering, where we talked about the difficulties and tools we could use to, to develop motivation, self-esteem, and all these things in an online environment.
Yes, and that's where I came in on your conversation, and I think this is obviously, I mean, not dealt with in the book, but it's a key issue now, is how, and I imagine that people are researching this around the clock now to work out how online teaching can be adapted to take into account motivational factors, identity factors, etc. Because there's so much working against it, it would seem, at least initially. And we talked a bit about this last session. I think that, you know, the challenge of creating a kind of classroom, a social dynamic in an online context. But because there's advantages to being online, as your group discussed, and I'm always, one of my favorite New Yorker cartoons is the the one of the dog at the computer saying, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And it's like, well, actually on the internet, nobody knows necessarily that you're a non-native speaker or that you're a learner. You could be a user. And there's a wonderful study was actually done quite some time ago, around about 2000, in the States, I think. There was a Chinese speaker, adolescent, user of English, I mean, in the sense that he went to an English school, but he felt extremely threatened. His identity was threatened, and he felt very uncomfortable, and he wasn't making any great success with his English, and was experiencing lots of negative emotions associated with that, anxiety, etc., sense of failure, low self-esteem. But he was interested in a certain genre of music, which was, in fact, if I remember rightly, it was not K-pop, but J-pop, yeah? So Japanese boy bands kinds of thing. And so he started an online group, a discussion kind of group, focused on J-pop. And it attracted people from all around the world who didn't care that they weren't proficient users of English, let's say, just as he, you know, that no longer became an issue. And they just simply communicated using English as a lingua franca about their shared interest, which was J-pop. And the researcher reports his motivation, his self-esteem, particularly self-esteem, over even a relatively short period of time running this group, like 2 or 3 months, went significantly higher. And he felt validated, yeah, to use the expression from last time, because he had found a use for his English. He had found an identity or a self, and I can't remember the name. The title uses the word self, or no, it's identity construction. He'd constructed an identity for himself, which was validated by his community of, and the argument is that could only have happened on the internet, in a sense. Yeah. Well, not only, but the internet provided a perfect platform for that kind of identity management, because they didn't, you know, this was year 2000. It wasn't like they were using Zoom even, so people didn't even know what he looked like, let alone that he was only 14 or 15. So there are interesting applications and implications for online learning and online communication. Anybody want to volunteer anything else that came up in their group that hasn't been covered that you'd like to share with us? On this subject?
We talked about pronunciation, the way is linked to identity, the way you sound, the way you sound basically gives away a lot of, you know, your background, where you're from, your country. And I talked about when I was living in Australia and I wanted to sound Australian to integrate, and I was trying to construct that identity, that Australian identity. But on the other hand, I didn't want to sound like an Australian, like a native Australian, because my other identity, the Italian identity, was kind of, you know, this is not who I am. This is not how I would naturally sound. So it was a kind of a clash of two identities in my brain.
Absolutely. But you seem to have succeeded at it. And I've commented, I don't know whether you've seen, Fabio, on the forum. This morning, I responded to your post about exactly that. Because I find that fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and how you've succeeded in a sense, again, in terms of identity creation through accent. And as I said in my response to the post, accent is perhaps the most significant marker of identity, both in your first language, where we're so tuned to people's accents, and the kids are attuned to people's accents. It's one of the first things, even before, more than appearance, more than skin color, or all these other factors, kids identify whether they feel any affinity with you or not on the basis of your accent. So that's in the first language. So imagine how important it is in the second language. Imagine how important it is for immigrants into a culture where they're being rejected on all sorts of reasons, but rejected initially on the basis of that, not rejected, but not welcomed, if you like, because they, as soon as they open their mouth, they sound foreign. And so I'm fascinated by what you've done, Fabio, because clearly you've created you've got a fantastic Australian accent, but it's also interesting that you should say that about the clash between, and this is well documented, people who are immigrants particularly, who feel a sense of identity loss, which can be existential, profound, as they lose track of their original language, accent, etc. And it's well, as I say, well documented in immigrant attrition over the years, where they forget their first language, but they lose aspects of their original identity. So it's a balancing act, of course. And I mean, I'd love to spend more time talking about this with you, Fabio, particularly because of what you've achieved. But I mean, everybody in this room is bilingual in some respect and speaks to a greater or lesser degree with an accent, a target-like accent. So you'll know yourselves, you'll know how difficult it is and how much time has to be put in to achieve that, and also how you have to have the aptitude, the ear for to be able to recognize the key markers of the accent. And it raises all these questions, and Fabio, you raised it in your post about English as an international language, and how we feel now that the current thinking is that we shouldn't force learners into trying to speak a native-like version of English, whatever that is, because there's so many different native-like versions. But we should disabuse our learners of the fact that they don't have to sound like native speakers. But as you said in your post, but what if they want to? Don't they have, isn't that a reasonable expectation? And I think James concurred that yes, it is a reasonable expectation that it might not be achievable, but you should have every chance of trying. So there's a real tension here between the literature, for example, on English as a lingua franca, where it would seem not to matter that you can retain your first language accent, and English as a second language or as an additional language, where you may be desperate to, and hence all the money that's spent on what's so-called accent reduction, particularly in North America, because people, and perhaps rightfully, fear that until they can pass as a native speaker, they will be marginalized. And that's a really interesting discussion. And it's all, as I say, it's clearly related to identity creation, identity loss. But it's not an option for everybody. And as I said, I mean, Carrie, I think in responding to your comment on the forum, I arrived in Spain too late and with not a very good aptitude for pronunciation, not a very good ear, to even pretend that I was going to be able to adapt or pass as a native speaker. So the irony was that whereas in Egypt, I didn't pass as a native speaker because I didn't look like an Egyptian or walk like an Egyptian. In Spain, I could probably pass as Spanish or Catalan, but I will never sound like one. So, as long as I don't open my mouth, I can get by. As soon as I open my mouth, I'm categorized as. So these are really, and there's some wonderful stories. I had a friend who speaks, American woman, she was a teacher in a school in this town in Barcelona, near Barcelona. She spoke fluent Catalan, and she, in the local shop where she used to buy her cigarettes, she always chatted cat. And then the owner of the shop discovered that his daughter was going to the school and that she was a teacher, and hadn't realized that she was American, just that she was Canada. So the next time she came in to buy some cigarettes, the owner had completely changed his way of talking. He started speaking to her like she was a foreigner, but in Catalan, but in a very reduced Catalan, because his perception of her identity changed when he realized, and therefore the whole language thing followed. Those stories. Anyway, listen. Let's move on. Has anybody got anything? I'm just going to open the presentation in a second, and then I'm going to hand over to Girish, who's going to tell us a little bit about self-determination theory. But before we do that, is there anything else, burning issues or questions or anything that you want to raise with respect particularly to the reading?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly mention that I especially like the example with this, like bridge to the future selves of the students. But again, I had a feeling that the teacher might impose too much of their own opinion. Like the examples that were mentioned were mostly work-oriented and traveling. But I thought, what if make learners more autonomous in this respect as well? Because they might have some dreams and ambitions that can never occur to the teacher himself. Like the example I gave might be, what if I want to sing in a foreign language? And this picture will particularly motivate me and maybe some of my group mates as well. The teacher will might never think about it. But if I choose the photo and project it on the screen, it might be beneficial for the class and for the student in question.
Exactly. And that's a really good point. I think we should be very cautious about assuming that learners have either uniform or kind of predictable ideal selves in their second language, and that these can change too. And I use my own example. In fact, I was talking about this just yesterday on a webinar with teachers in Canada about how I decided to kind of, with my own Spanish, to focus on giving talks in Spanish about what I do in English. Yeah, so it's a transfer from, instead of doing what I'm doing now, talking about methodology and second language acquisition in English, but which meant that I needed to focus very much on not the presentation skills, which I have, or I hope, but on the vocabulary particularly, which I'd never really thought about, all the vocabulary associated with terms like, task-based learning, feedback, phonemes and all that sort of thing. How do you say that in Spanish? But having a more limited objective helped, I think, folks. But it took a while before that ideal self materialized. It was only because people were asking me to give talks in Spanish that I thought, well, maybe this is something I could do. So yeah. And James, did you have your hand up?
I just wanted to mention a little story that Stevik tells in one of his books about his daughter learning French. And she's really, really good. And she speaks with a wonderful French accent. But in school, when she's called on, she reverts back to an American accent when she's speaking French, because she doesn't want to stick out and alienate herself from her fellow students.
Exactly. No, that's also well attested at adolescence. You don't want to seem to be, and people will laugh. And I remember that saying, somebody who produces a sentence in perfectly intonated English, sounding like an English speaker, the other students will often laugh because it's a kind of mismatch with their identity. And I think also, autobiographically, one of the hardest languages to learn for young adolescent boys, is French, because it seems to involve so much, dare I say, non-masculine kind of mouth movements, and just a word like petit pois it just runs counter to, what young New Zealand schoolboys should be doing or saying or looking like. So that you're not a good choice of language. So when I got into learning German, I was much more successful at German than I was at French. Okay, let's just, yes, Leonilda. Can you unmute?
Yeah, okay. There we go. Can you hear me?
Oh, no, you've gone
All
off
right,
again.
here we go. Just about what James said about the French, just yesterday, my daughter was telling me about her English class. She's online with distance learning, and she was supposed to do a little interaction with one of her classmates. And the teacher told her to tone it down. And she wasn't able to understand what she meant. And so she said, but this is the way I speak. She speaks with a Canadian accent and she's living in Italy. And the teacher said, well, your classmate doesn't understand. So you're going to have to sound a little bit more Italian.
Wow.
And she just didn't know how to do it. And so she just said, I just spoke slower because this is the way I sound. I can't really put on an Italian accent if I don't have one. And so it was just thinking of the American accent in French when you're in class. So, and this is where the doubting of the self and, if I sound this way, why do you want me to sound differently? Just to not make others feel bad. So that I just want to,
No, that
talk about
fascinating.
that.
Yeah.
It's a great way to get rid of telesales people as well. If you put on the English accent in Spanish when they're calling you to try and sell you something, and you say, I don't understand, but you say in Spanish, but in an English accent, and they hang up very quickly.
Yeah, Carrie, I don't have that problem because they know instantly that I'm not Spanish, and they often revert. They say, and I've been living in Spain for 30 years, and they'll still say, would you like me to speak English to you? And I said, no, how am I going to learn Spanish if you constantly switch back? Margaret. Where are you? Oh.
Margaret, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Yeah. Sorry. I was in group 4 with Cecilia and Sinem, and we were talking a little bit about the role of the teacher in the discovery of the self, or in these examples that you mentioned, maybe in the killing of the self, right? Because that's basically what happened. And Cecilia also brought an interesting question on motivation and self-discipline, because that's not something that is quite explored in this chapter. But are they linked? If so, how much? Right, Cecilia?
Yeah. I was telling them, can I just add something, Scott? I was telling them that I'm really struggling with one of my groups this term. I teach EAP at a private university here in Turkey, and I teach 2 groups, right? One group is amazing. They are wonderful. But my main group, since day one, they seem like very demotivated. They don't want to be there. And I believe I'm the same person with both groups, but I have very different rapport with each group. And I was telling Margaret and Sinem about how they make me feel. Like it seems the way I read them, it seems that they put all the responsibility on the teacher, like all the burden. I can feel the burden, like I'm here, you need to teach me, you need to motivate me. And they don't take any responsibility whatsoever. I mean, this is my impression, right? With this group. So what is the role of motivation and self-discipline, right? It's because the text didn't address in a way, right? Self-discipline. It's not the same as self-efficacy, but maybe they are related. I don't know.
Possibly. And I'm also thinking, and I'll come to this in a second, about the concept of self-regulation, which I guess is synonymous with the ability to regulate your own learning. But it's not necessarily something that people have, but they might be able to be trained into. but anything that you have to be trained into, you have to want to do, really. And so again, it comes back to this thing of, do they really want to make the effort? We all know that language learning requires a considerable amount of self-study. I mean, particularly vocabulary acquisition. You don't have to sell that idea to people, but the question is, and I guess it comes back to, we'll talk about motivation in a second again, we look at self-determination theory, but where the regulation comes from initially, or does it come from external forces? Are you in the absence of intrinsic motivation, or just the sheer pleasure of doing it? And if your learners are not self-regulated, it may be that they get no pleasure out of regulating their own learning, or not that they don't see the point of it, but it's just like too much effort for too few gains, actually. And I think that might also have something to do with self-efficacy theory. But thank you, Cecilia, for raising that. I'm conscious that we're running out of time. We're in our 30 minutes. What's it called in football time? And I'm just going to
extra time.
So again, as I said before, if you have to leave, do. The recording is still on. You'll be able to catch up with it. I just want to see what I can get through some of the issues that I wanted to raise. That in a sense we've covered, but just to bring them together. I mean, the key thing, obviously, in the Arnold article is the notion of self, and looking at the way that self collocates in the literature with so many different expressions, like self-concept, self-determination theory. We'll come back to that in a second with Girish. Self-efficacy is used, self-discrepancy, and I'm just going to move the bar here. I can't see what self-esteem, yeah, which is central to Arnold's view of things, and then that's the self-regulation and self-directed learning, which is the same, self-empowerment, which we'll come to. Some definitions that I took from a book on psychology in English language, in language learning, edited by Sarah Mercer. And these will be available for you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but the notion of what self-concept is, one self-image, if you like, and then self-determination theory. And now I want to hand over to Girish, because he's volunteered to explain a little bit about what self-determination theory is. So Girish, can you take over?
Yeah, sure. It's going to take approximately 10 to 12 minutes, if that's fine with you.
That's fine with me.
Okay, I hope with everybody too. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now.
Oh, I might have to give you sharing rights. Oh God, help me.
You'll have to make me a co-host. It might be easier.
Okay. Okay, there we go. Okay. You should be able to share now, Girish.
All right. Yes, I am. All right. I shot this video, I think last year when I was preparing for a webinar for British Council. And I would like you guys to watch this video. It's 30 seconds long. If you could please guess the language while you're listening and watching it.
วันศุกร์แม่ไปเจอกับผู้ชายคนอื่นที่บ้านอื่นๆแล้วทำไมไม่ไปที่ประชุมแล้วก็มีกรรมการแล้วก็สู้กันว่าทำไมรอตั้งแต่วันนี้ครับคืออย่างนี้ลูกเมื่อวันศุกร์ที่แล้วใช่ไหมเนี่ยมีเกือบ200 คนซึ่งมันเป็นจำนวนที่เยอะมากเพราะเวลาที่เปิดประชุมทีเนี่ยเรายังไม่เคยมีลูกบ้านเข้าประชุมถึง200 คนเลยนะใช่200 คนแต่คราวนี้มีคนที่ไม่เห็นด้วยกับการยกเลิกรปภเนี่ยถึง200 คน
เกินกว่าจำนวนผู้เข้าประชุมหมู่บ้าน
เรียก
ด้
ว่า
วย
เกินยกเลิกการยกเลิกรบพโอเคขอบคุณครับแม่ขอให้โชคดีครับ Okay, I think this should not be a difficult guess. Oh yes, a lot of them Thai, exactly. I am in Thailand and I have been learning Thai for the past 2 years, and mostly it's independently because my experience of learning Thai in a language classroom with Thai teachers hasn't been the most motivating or satisfying. And last year I was reflecting on my improvement because I have been able to improve my Thai proficiency level. I'm better than I started. And when I reflected, I realized these conversations with my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, they played a significant role, and they helped me improve. Now, at the same time, last year, I came across a podcast by Liam Printer, and he's a Irish man teaching Spanish to high school children in Switzerland. And he introduced me to self-determination theory. And this is what the theory says. Think about children. As you see children, they are naturally curious about things. They're naturally active, playful. They want to know more. And that's what the theory says, that as humans, we are naturally inclined towards mastery, inquisitiveness, want to know more, find out more things. And the theory says these natural tendencies need to be supported. And for that, there are these particular 3 basic psychological needs that need to be satisfied. And these are the 3 ones. Would anyone like to guess which are these 3 psychological needs? ARC, they start with ARC. I think this is all we've been mentioning. The first one
Ambition,
says,
maybe?
Yeah, that's it, Scott. Yes, autonomy. Yeah, and the theory says here, autonomy doesn't necessarily mean independence or detachment. The theory says that here, with autonomy, we mean the sense or a feeling of power to use our own will, the freedom of choice. The relatedness is, I think we've been covering this from our last chapter, that relatedness, that means connection towards the content, the teacher, the other learners and other factors inside the classroom. Yes, I think Katrina, thank you for guessing that. And C, this one is a sense, a feeling that you can do it. At Ruth had mentioned this about this, the ability, the feeling that you can do it and you will be able to do it. These are 3 psychological needs that this theory says has to be satisfied for us to be intrinsically motivated. And I think it was Carrie who was talking about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Here it's all about intrinsic motivation. Going back to my video, the Thai video, and my reflection, I was trying to connect these 2. And I realized that these conversations I was having with my mother-in-law, these were initiated by me. And I would go on and talk about certain topics, mostly they were self or pre-decided topics in my head. I would go out and talk to her and share our opinion. And these topics, they were directly concerned with our regular lives, from our real lives. Because in the video, we are talking about the township that we live in. There was apparently some corruption going on, and my mother feels very strongly about it. And we both had a lot of things to share. And because we come from diverse culture, background, upbringing, I'm very curious to understand her thoughts and share mine too, and to connect with her better. And we were able to do that. And thirdly, the best part was at the end of these conversations, every conversation, it boosted my confidence because I felt I can actually hold a conversation with a native Thai speaker. She's native Thai and I could understand 75% of the conversation at least, and the rest of it I would try to second guess it through the context. So I realized, okay, there is a connection. Now, how can I put this connection or this self-determination theory into my classroom practice? How does it look like inside the classroom? And I got the opportunity so this was the basis I had kept in mind, conversations and intrinsic motivation. And I had the opportunity to teach an in-service Indian teacher who would teach English. And this is a little background on her. And the first thing I did was
the needs analysis form, I adapted it to find out a little more about her social life too, a little bit about her personal life. These are a few questions I added to the needs analysis form. And just to let you know, the content was completely from whatever I had got from her. I was trying to use authentic context and content. They did not use any course books, and this was a one-on-one online training, and it was 30 minutes discussion. It was a flipped classroom approach. I would give her the content or the topic a day prior, and we would have certain 3 questions minimum, which I would share, which we would discuss on. And sometimes I would give her the key expressions also, which I would like her to use in the conversation. So some of the activities, these were some of her interests that I found out from the needs analysis form. Ashok Saraf is an Indian actor. Sudha Murthy is again an Indian personality. So some of these activities, like one of the first one had to be Liam's podcast episode. I shared that with her, and because she's a teacher, I knew it would resonate with her, and she would want this to take to her classroom too. So we had a lot to share. Another one was, again, this singer, EA, I think Prince EA, she likes him a lot. And this particular song is quite provocative. Don't go back to school. Talks about the American, I think last year, the situation in America. Again, a lot to talk about. Personally, she was attached to it. She wanted to share. And these were some questions. Again, I just highlighted certain language that she could use, and an error that I found in her language. I highlighted that too in our discussion. I would have it in front of her. And to make it a little competitive, I had this flippity, and we would have scoring system where every time she used a key expression, a word or a phrase, we would give points to each other. And I kept it competitive. I included myself too in this. So we kept that way. The next week, the second week, I handed over the onus to her and asked her to select the content. And she would write the questions which we would discuss in the class. And the first thing she selected was Sudha Murthy's blog post. She's a very prominent personality in India, a feminist and a role model to her, to Apurva. This was a poem that she was supposed to teach to her students in the classroom. So she was personally invested in this. She wanted to share and talk about this. Oh, this picture, stimulating. And she selected it. Oh God, we had a lot to share and talk about this one. And then this guy is Ashok Saraf. He's a regional film actor. And I chose this particular scene, a Marathi movie scene, and she had to translate it to English. And then we role played that dialogue inside the classroom. And we did that, and we laughed. We laughed till we cried. Now, at this point, I would like to highlight that Apurva considers me as a proficient language user, and she looks up to me. So every time she was able to share her thoughts, her ideas, especially these such strong thoughts, personal and intimate ideas, her confidence boosted. And she confessed this at the end of the training, that previously she'd be very hesitant to communicate with people who were on a higher proficiency level, especially her headmistress. She had mentioned this, that earlier she would be shy to talk with her headmistress, but post the training, she was much more confident that she could hold the conversation. Now, I don't know if there is time available. There's one activity I would like to do with every one of you right now. It will take around 30 seconds. Scott, do you think there is time? I think
if it's 30 seconds, yes.
30 seconds, yes. Not more than 30 seconds, this one. I would like everyone to close their eyes. I'm going to play a song, music, and I would like you to tell me at the end of it, at the end of this, what you saw and how you felt. 30 seconds, I'm going to play it now. Thank you. unfortunately, I don't have time to take your responses, but we did this activity and there was a lot, and she wanted to share it. Of course, with you guys, I don't have to give you this, but I shared this with her previously so she can talk, she can use the language too when talking about this music, how she felt. Of course, at the end of each class, there was a delayed error correction for her to look up or improve on. There was also a writing task where she would write her thoughts on the class at the end of it, what she felt, how she felt, and how well she did it. And we both would write. And there was feedback too. Again, the feedback, I had a rule that minimum 3 positive and maximum 3 areas of improvement. These were some of them. And before the webinar, I actually interviewed Apurva to ask how did she feel and what has changed in her teaching and how does she feel? How is it now? And this is her voice. I would like you guys to hear what she has to say.
My teaching was, I felt, very monotonous, where my students' participation or my students' role was very, very small. But then here in this training, I understood that students' role must be bigger than teacher's role, because if you're talking about language learning, then your student has to speak, your student has to get chance to open up and to share his or her views. So always we should give chance to our students to speak and to communicate, and we should give them freedom to use their own mother tongue or other languages also, to just make them free and just to make them independent, just to improve their confidence, self-confidence.
All
So
right.
this training was really important for me.
Yeah, I was very happy to hear that. And now I consciously make an effort to ensure that these 3 psychological needs I try to inculcate in the classes. And that's what I've learned from self-determination theory. Thank you, Scott. Over to you.
Thank you,
Girish. Thank you.
Great. And then actually that segues quite nicely into, in the time we've got left, I just want to look at the L2 motivational theory, which if you watch Jessica's video, interview, was that the kind of construct that she was using. But I can see quite a lot of overlap here between self-determination theory as well. And I think those 3 concepts, yeah, thank you, Girish. That was great and nice to see it exemplified in a classroom setting. So let's just go back to my list of words. Self-directed learning is fairly obvious. Self-efficacy, I think, has been defined in the book. But that's an important concept, I think, again, is the learner's beliefs about their own capabilities and related to their self-esteem. And this we talked about when we were talking about with Cecilia, you're talking about discipline. I mentioned self-regulation, the process by which the learner takes responsibility or agency in activating the learning processes, and something that they may need to be trained to do or given help with. So those are from definitions from, as I say, from this book. But there's another one I think comes up, this self-discrepancy, the mismatch between one's actual self and one's ideal or ought self, which is brings us to the notion of self-guides. Yeah, the notion of the ideal self that can guide us and motivate us. So those are some of the common kind of, as I say, self-worth. There's plenty more of them. There's also types of self that are identified in the literature, and Jane Arnold mentions a number. One's actual self, your ideal or imagined second language self, and then the self, if you like, the extrinsic, what other people feel that you should be like, yeah, or should become, your parents or your teachers or your peers or your boss or whatever. And then the feared self, what you don't want to be, which is like perhaps, humiliated when you speak a second language. And then Stevik himself talks about the critical and performing self. So on one hand, we have the self that performs our language use, but there is part of us is sort of criticizing, aware that we're not achieving the degree of accuracy or fluency or whatever that we would like. And there's this kind of tension here between the performing self and the critical self. I'm taking that chunk from his book. So yeah, so lots of different ways of construing the self. Just to go back to the ideal self theory, which a bit, also has three components. Your imagined self, how you would like to be as a second language user, which, as was pointed out, is not necessarily static either, and can change and develop. Your ought to self, what extrinsically is kind of people's expectations of you are. But very importantly, I think in this model is the actual L2 learning experience itself. And that may be just as important, if not more important, than these idealizations. So I'm thinking particularly of, teenagers, adolescents who may not have a very clear idea of what they want to be like as a speaker of the second language, but nevertheless, the experience of learning the language is enjoyable enough to kind of make it redundant. The idea of having a goal, so is what I distinguish between having a motive for learning English. Let's say you may not have a motive, but it's still, you may have a motivation. That motivation comes from what you do in the classroom. So if the person we would like to become, this is the notion of the ideal self, and bridging that discrepancy. But as I say, if you don't have that, or it's difficult to imagine your L2 self, it may be simply enough to have a good language learning experience. So this is where the teacher, I think, can be particularly influential. And I've been discussing ways of doing that in the forum to a certain extent. And I think this is where what you were talking about, Girish, has an impact here. One way that the learning experience can be valuable is whether they do have a sense of relatedness. So, what's happening in the classroom does relate, at least, if not to their ideal self, but to their interests and needs, etc. And that they have a degree of autonomy in be able to use the language to talk about things that they want to. And what was the third one? And that their competence, of course, is constantly being supported by what goes on in the classroom and what they do outside the classroom. So I'm not going to go into this. This is the stages of developing your plan, if you like, your strategy, your based on the L2 motivational self theory. And these are the kinds of stages that Jessica enacted in her study, where she got learners to visualize how they might be in some future English-speaking context. And the only other construct I want, and these were the kinds of activities that you can get in most books. This comes from the book that Jessica used, Motivating Learning, co-written by Jill Hadfield and Zoltan Durniai, which is a number of tasks and activities which are consistent with this theory. There's only one other new construct that I want to mention here, and that's this notion of willingness to communicate, which is a relatively new arrival in the literature on motivation. But I think it's quite a powerful concept because it brings together a lot of these different factors. So willingness to communicate is exactly what it says on the label. It's a person's readiness to enter into discourse at a particular time, a specific person using the L2. But what it's composed of is a number of kind of personality, more stable personality features, whether extrovert, introvert, that kind of thing, as well as situational features. This moment in time, is this a situation in which I want to communicate, including who you're communicating with? So it's often described in terms of this kind of pyramid of your social and individual characteristics at the bottom, which are probably not easily manipulated, and working through a number of different layers, coming to the actual moment in time where the communication is taking place. And all these different factors impact on that moment in time and your readiness to communicate. And I think the other important thing to note about this, as we'll just skip ahead, is that it's a reciprocal process. It takes, as this writer says, it can be enhanced, it can only be enhanced and developed through social processes, communicating with others. If your interlocutor is not interested in you, not willing to give you the chance to communicate, or is not going to hear you, doesn't validate what you're saying, then of course the willingness to communicate will dissipate. Okay, so I had a couple of other activities I wanted to share with you, but we don't have time, but I'll put them onto, I'll leave it on the slide anyway, and maybe make a commentary, just things from books on, or the literature on humanist techniques for second language acquisition. And we'll perhaps resume that during the discussion. What is a humanist educational philosophy, and how does this, what features of motivational theory, for example, does humanism incorporate? We've got 2 or 3 minutes left. Any last comments or questions or anything before we close? Once again, Girish, thank you so much for your intervention. And incidentally, the invitation is still open. If anybody else sees a topic that they would like to present on, then please let me know. Just email me and we'll incorporate you into the design of things. I've already had volunteers to talk about narrative in the session we do on story. Anything else you'd like to raise that can't go into the forum? And as I said, I'll open the forum discussions almost immediately. The post this session discussion, where we can wrap up some of the issues that have come up, but also the one that anticipates the next session, which is the chapter on, by me, actually, I think, on the learning body. James.
Yeah, I just wanted to hook onto that willingness to communicate with what Norton Pierce talked about, the right to speak in the immigrant situation, where if you're not being heard, as you said, your interlocutor is not giving you the room to sort of quelching your willingness. She's, in one of her articles, she shows how she kind of nurtured her learners to take the right to speak and not to be put off and not to give up their rights simply because they have a foreign accent or they're struggling with the language. Maybe you could say something about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, it's very interesting. You mentioned willingness to communicate was a concept that came not from language originally, it was from mainstream psychology, that some people in their first language are more willing to communicate in certain situations. And there are definite issues, which might make somebody unwilling to communicate, which are related to the social context in the first language, or things like gender, for example. And Bonnie Norton's study was done with immigrant women, so that they had two things, in a sense, that could have prejudiced their or inhibited their willingness to communicate the fact that they were immigrants, but also their gender, which perhaps didn't give them as many rights to be heard in certain contexts. And so some of the women who were able to kind of be successful, and Norton's original study had to, in a sense, assert themselves more than they might normally in their own culture, to compensate for these particular constraints. And I think those are sort of things that we need to bear in mind, that particularly in teaching immigrants, but I think any learners, that there are, we are perhaps teaching them, yeah, it's not just about language, it's about communication skills generally, and giving them the confidence to take the turn, to take the right to speak, as well as giving them the linguistic devices to do that. I mean, everybody, you know, teaching conversation strategies, for example, communication strategies, there's not a lot of attention given to it in textbooks and things, but learning how to broach a subject, a topic yourself in a conversation with little expressions like, well, that reminds me, well, funny you should say that, or speaking of which, yeah, to be able to negotiate the conversation and to take a turn or to initiate a turn. There's linguistic factors involved, but there are also obviously psychological and social factors involved. And that's why I think the classroom is a good place to practice these strategies, because the classroom, as we conceive it, is a safe space where people shouldn't feel afraid of voicing their opinion and of being heard and being validated. But we need to establish that. Again, it comes back to what we were talking about last week about trust. But yeah, thank you, James, for raising all sorts of issues there. That Bonnie Norton, incidentally, the studies that she's done, I mean, it's a second edition of her book on identity and language learning, if you're interested, and it's based on her original study of these immigrant women in Canada. And she teases out a lot of these different issues about identity. She's another South African, actually, Adrienne, although she works in Canada. She's got an enchanting accent. Anything else? I just feel we never have enough time. This is ridiculous. I've got to have a whole other half. I'm going to have to, I don't know, devise a, well, we've got the forum, so go on board, and I'll post another short narrated presentation of the stuff that I wasn't able to cover, but that's okay. And we'll see you again here, same time, same place next week on Sunday. So have a great week, everybody, and we look forward to interacting on the forum. Thanks once again. Thanks, Girish, for your.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.